Well, good evening, everyone. I would like to call this meeting of the Board of we don't have a quorum of the board, so I don't think we have to take a formal roll call, so we can move right into our business. I believe Mr. Steve Carroll is available on the phone or Zoom. So good evening, Mr. Carroll, as well. We'll try to make this meeting a little quicker this time because that's just to recap what we did last time. We did an introduction of what the purpose of this committee was. And one of the things that we're going to try to do before the legislative session begins in January is to identify 3 to 4 positions that this committee would recommend to the Board of Education to be our legislative priorities. We circulated last time the legislative platform from last year, which will still be a process that Dr. Adams and Mr. Carroll come up with of all of the sort of large buckets, I think, that we oppose or that we support, that we can provide that information for things that we think will come up in the legislative session. But rather than just sort of sit passively with our positions, we want to actually identify some things that we can pursue proactively. So with that, what we've circulated to everyone tonight is just our legislative platform from last year in a different format. And all of those are listed, and there's an indication on the side of that. So what I'm going to ask this committee to do tonight, and hopefully you've had a chance to review those, and maybe you have some ideas that you want to share. I hope you do. We can go through those. So I'll take suggestions. If everybody feels prepared to identify 2 or 3, we can just go around the room and you can indicate that. And maybe we can easily come to a consensus, or we can do some homework since most of the people in the room are educators. You can fill out that form and then we can go through it. I'm open to suggestions. Anyone? Do we think people have things ready to share?
I
Yes,
have a
ma'am.
question.
Yes.
Mr. Davis, there were so many, unfortunately, so many of them that touched on the charter school issue. I had a hard time trying to figure out which one would be the most pressing.
Okay.
So I was wondering if Mr. Carroll had some insight on that.
Sure. Mr. Carroll, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
I think without a doubt, as far as what's coming up in the next legislative session, especially after what I learned at last week's summer caucus of the House Republicans, that the local charter funding bill will be a major charter bill for next year, that the education choice community and obviously the local charters are going to be pushing, regardless if Kansas City has come up with a so-called agreement or not. Obviously, we're in the lawsuit, and I think that will probably be, if you're looking at roughly $17 million a year, I think that's probably one of the major ones that we probably need to deal with. And I know that Eric Scroggins met with some of the legislators last week, and he indicated their big deal that they're pushing for their charter for this funding is they're calling it equitable funding for charter schools, getting their fair share of the local funds. I had a meeting this morning with the majority leader, Dean Plocker, and indicated that in no way, shape, or form we could accept that. and he understood that our expenses are higher than those of the charters. By the way, I might also add, and you should know this, Matt, and members of the committee, that next Wednesday at noon, the House Budget Committee is going to hold a hearing on local charter funding. And I have asked Dr. Adams to come to Jefferson City for that hearing to testify on behalf of the San Luis Public Schools and the costs surrounding our educating the child versus the charters. I talked last week at the conference with the chairman, budget chairman, Cody Smith, and he agreed that Dr. Adams, they should allow him to come and present our side of the story because the charter folks are going to be there in full force. So I just might throw that out for you.
And that's next Wednesday?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me ask you this, Steve. So in terms of the purposes of what we're doing here, if we identified that as a measure that wanted to be one of our legislative priorities, that we do not want that bill to pass, would it be reasonable, would it be prudent to also combine that with another priority that's on here? And I'm just looking at the one that talks about requiring charter schools to be held to the same academic standard as all public schools.
Mhm.
I think absolutely. I think you could combine the two to get more bang for your buck, so to speak. Obviously, I know that you all are looking at trying to get a charter school moratorium. And obviously that can't take place at the city level. That also has to take place with state statute. So again, this whole charter school thing, there's several issues that really go together.
Okay, that's good. That's helpful.
And I'll just add that, as Steve knows, I have been involved with the charters for really the last 8 to 10 years. And I've been to Jeff City and testified for the district in opposition to many of the charter proposals over the years. So when I look at this list, they are so interrelated, the charter ones, but the ones that really stuck out to me were opposing new additional local funding that diverts funds away from the district. And, I guess that's the same, that is the one.
That is the
know-
local funding, yes.
Yes. And so that the moratorium on the charter schools, as Steve said, is clearly important.
Now, also, just to throw out there for you, Matt, and members of the committee, the provision just above that, talking about the local funding, where it also talks about opposing charter schools funding for their infrastructure and deferred maintenance. They tried to get in the Opportunity Trust and the charters this year, $5 million for deferred maintenance. And the governor vetoed it. And so I know that next Wednesday, they're going to be talking about deferred maintenance as well. So that will be a topic that comes up as well, Dr. Adams, just so you know, before that hearing.
So just to sort of recap, if we were to combine this into one item regarding charter school funding, as well as charter school academic standards, it would be opposing alterations to the local funding. I keep wanting to call that House Bill 137, but I guess we need to move on from last year. It would be including a moratorium on new charter schools in the city of St. Louis. I know speaking with some legislators, there was a theory in Jeff City that would be unconstitutional. But I'll ask the other two lawyers who are education and legislative experts, but it seemed to me you changed 2 words in the statute that just says, no, DESE should not approve any applications for till such and such in a metropolitan school district, but we can discuss that more in a future session. And then we would talk about legislation that requires charter schools to be held to the same academic standards. Would we need to include the infrastructure? Because while that is funding, it doesn't really affect us, does it? Or does it? Is that funding that is taken from our district to them?
No, I would recommend not muddying the waters with that and keep that separate. That's just my
Right.
opinion.
Okay.
And while I also think, we talked about the moratorium, I don't want to commingle both the local funding and the moratorium in the same, bullet point, because I think that dilutes our argument. We know that, this legislature under the current leadership isn't going to put a moratorium out there, but we do think that we can stop, hopefully, if things work accordingly as they did this year, we can stop the local funding issue. So I think holding them to the same academic standards, while not losing any of our money to the charters based upon the cost of educating the child, I think we can do something like that. But I don't think I'd put the moratorium in with the local funding. I don't know if you agree, Dr. Adams, but I think that's probably wise.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think the legislative body gets really confused when you have multiple things you're trying to get across. I think it needs to be really singular. In my opinion, I would have one thing I'm strongly opposing and one thing I'm strongly supporting. And I know you might want to have a third one. It's a third one, but I would think one thing you're strongly supporting, one thing you're strongly opposing, because I think it gets really muddy after that 20 times.
Okay. That makes sense. My only thought, and maybe this is not, maybe this is just sort of the message that goes along with opposing the local funding changes, is not only to talk about the economic differences in the service that we provided, that you provided to the legislators last year, and I think you said there's a 3-pager that was developed, and they were very, very eager to have that information. But and just correct me if I'm wrong, the academic standards, and there's a 4-pager that I think MSBA puts out about the difference in statutes between charter schools and public schools, and the requirements that we have that they don't have. And does that help with the funding argument as well, talking about differences, or should we keep those two separate in terms of our responsibilities and the standards that we're held to, and then the funding differences?
I would stay away from it only because we've not had a state test in the last 2 years, and the data is not really clear. And so charters are always going to bounce back till we haven't had a test and all of those kinds of things. So I think that kind of muddies the water because there's not been any kind of state assessment. And I really think DESE is dancing around that fact and the fact that they're about to go to MSIP 6. And as you might already know, Opportunity Trust has made the state's assessments a real issue. And Jeff City saying that is weak and all of those kinds of things. So I think I would stay away from the assessment piece only because we've not taken any kind of state assessment, and there's nothing really to judge in any kind of appreciable way other than what they have kind of put up.
Okay. So I guess we can, it sounds like there's pretty broad consensus that at least one of our priorities should be to oppose any changes in local funding regarding charter schools. Would that be any opposition to that? Anyone want to speak any more on that? Okay, well, we can put that down as number one that we can take to the full board as a suggestion. Good evening, Ms. Cousins. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, you didn't miss. Yeah, we can hear you. We didn't miss much. What we're doing is we are identifying 3 to 4 priorities from the list of the legislative platform last year that we're going to recommend to the full Board of Education to be our legislative priorities going into the next session of the legislature. Okay, anyone else see something else on this list that you would like to discuss as possibly including for one of our legislative priorities for next year? We did talk about last time, and I'll just bring this up. We did talk about, and there's two on here that are somewhat related. But if you go to the first page, there's support adding a new category for weighted factors for transient students with the factor ratio at 25, and then skipping down a couple, support legislation to help reduce homelessness. And it goes on to that one. So we did talk about addressing that. We also did talk about supporting proactive local measures. Our state legislature will reduce violence against children. And again, those are two separate issues, but to some extent, it creates the same sort of issues that we end up having to deal with, where external factors that are happening in our community affect our students' abilities to learn. So any thoughts about those?
Mr. Davis?
Yes,
do you mind
ma'am.
if I say something? I would say from speaking with parents across the district, those two issues of both homelessness and transience in children and also gun violence that our children suffer from disproportionately in the city are two major concerns that our parents in this district have. So any efforts that our board can take to advocate for solutions to both of those problems would be strongly supported by parents at all levels across our district. And I've heard from parents that those are two major concerns that they have, that they want to address.
Right.
I would totally agree with you. The only addition I would add, and Mr. Carroll could probably speak to this, is that there needs to be a little bit more teeth into what we're asking for, because it's so general. You could drive a truck through it. So I think it's really just about clarifying what we want to see as a result of this. So I think some nuances around what you're really asking for, because it's so generalized. That would be my only add. I totally agree. I just think we need to make sure there's a little bit more teeth in what we're asking for.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
I agree with Dr. Adams, and that was going to be my question. What role are we as a board in looking to play in reference to this legislation? We know gun violence is a huge issue, as well as homelessness, but how and what will we as a board do in reference to rallying the troops, so to speak, to go into Jeff City to say this is what we want to stand behind?
Yeah, and I had that same concern, Dr. Adams, so I'm glad you brought that up, which is good. And Ms. Willis pointed this out to me. We do have a more specific one in there talking about adding a category for a weighted factor. I don't know, Ms. Banks, if you can speak to that, because that gets into school funding formula, and my knowledge is very basic.
Well, regarding the addition of a new category for transient students, I guess one of my questions would be, sorry that I wasn't here last week or last month, but how the factor of the 25% came about. And of course, this impacts, I'm anticipating the foundation formula. So I understand it would be to add a new category that would obviously mean additional funding through the foundation formula, which would mean additional funding from DESE, which would be a big push right there. So I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, maybe I should just back up and try to, my understanding, and you can correct me where I'm wrong. So currently the weighted formula, there's 3 categories. It's free and reduced lunch. It's ELL learners and special education, correct?
Correct.
So in a district like ours, and I looked at the category, I mean, there's nobody that even is close to the amount of students, the students in transition that we have. And so we don't get, there's no weighted formula taking them into account. Now, they may fit some of those other categories.
Yes.
And so they may count. I mean, so we have a lot of people that count for free and reduced lunch. And some of those kids may qualify under special education laws as well. So there may be some overlaps. We may be getting funding, a weighted formula based on them. But because we have such a large population and, the weighted formula is because those students cost more to educate, that takes it into account. So I guess the assumption, and when this was developed and put in here, is that we are missing some funding for students that cost more to educate if they don't fit in those other categories. I had a question too about the 25 because
Hey, Matt,
that didn't seem like the right number.
Matt, can I jump in here and kind of
Absolutely.
explain some of the background? I came up with this provision probably 6 years ago to have it included in the formula. When we first looked at revising the formula back in 2005, there was some discussions on transient students at that time, but it ended up just doing the other three instead because of a cost factor. Well, when Richard Gaines started this, the option to remain for a student, no matter where you may move within the city, that the school district would provide transportation to keep that child in the same school throughout the year, we were able to get some state funding for that. The problem was that the children that move around a lot, it affects their test scores, obviously. They get further and further behind, and it costs the school district more money to educate those children. And so our idea was, let's put a 25% weighted factor in there, as we do with free and reduced lunch, because we know we have lots of transient students, and any student that moves more than twice in the school year would fall under that category. I know that Kansas City has many of the same problems as well as some other school districts, but obviously we do. So that's where it came about. The question with certain legislators, there's a steep price tag to this, but what would the school district do with that additional money that came through the formula? So there was talk that, all right, if we add this categorical, then we have to have some agreement with the district that this money would be used specifically for homelessness, or try to do something to keep that child in the same school, such as the option to remain that we used to have. So that's kind of the background of it, just so you know where it came from and why.
Quick question for Steve. Steve, did the formula pre the revision in 2005, didn't it include gifted and homeless? Wasn't that part of the revision in 2005, was to remove those two categories from the formula?
Well, it was. I think that the gifted, they put that part of the new formula, as I understand it. Angie probably knows it better than I, but you're correct on that. And the weighted formula would come on an, on a weighted factor as well. So obviously.
So I just bring that up. One, I think it's a good discussion. Perhaps it needs a little more research into how much that actually would calculate. I don't know how difficult that would be to figure out, whether or not that would even be worth a push. But because it was on here and it seemed to be something more specific, I thought maybe we could bring that up. So maybe we can sort of table that and see if there's more information. But also, I think, if we want to just include the broad strokes of reducing homelessness and gun violence now, we certainly have time. And next on the agenda is to talk about how we go about formulating more specifics and, bringing more attention. It could just very well be that it becomes an advocacy position that we have. And that, it's a call to drive attention to it, and maybe there will be some other suggestions in the community, or we could maybe make it just a little more specific without full details, but we could table that for now. So if everybody agrees, if anybody opposes, we can put those two on the list and we can develop more details later. And table the formula calculation, the weighted factor for students in transition for another day. Is that good?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that me?
Tony,
Yes, ma'am?
go ahead. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, I always call you ma'am.
Definitely, yes, Matt. You're on, in my opinion, we're on the right track to go in that direction. I would table the formula, but at some point we need to still identify what that formula will actually look like. We definitely should focus on the gun violence because we've lost far too many kids within the district, within the city, not to have a game plan, even if it's collaborating with other organizations that's actually focusing on that huge cause.
Great, so we will add that as number 2. So our hope is to have 3, we could have 4. So does anybody have anything else on this list that strikes them as something that we should highlight? Yes, ma'am, Miss Willis.
Well, part of the reason I think it was so hard for me to narrow down is because I think that all of these points give us an opportunity to talk and give us an opportunity to raise awareness. If we narrow down the ones that we can actually actively go for, and that Mr. Carroll can give us some type of idea of how we can move forward with the ones that you handled as the heavy hitters, then some of these other things may just be points that we can bring out to explain the dollar gaps. It's almost a grid for explaining how things are in St. Louis Public versus how they are elsewhere. The one thing that I wanted to point out was that in the transportation formula, for instance, they're talking, I thought it was interesting, they're talking about eliminating magnet school transportation costs for efficiencies, but there are no numbers, and we could possibly put numbers to that, even if it's not something we push forward. So that was just a thought that everything on here just jumps off the page at me.
I might add to that, Lori, eliminating that efficiency ratio on the magnet schools, I think would help the district somewhat. We're the only school district in the state that gets hit with that based upon the mandates for our magnet school program. I know in talking with some Republican legislators last week at their conference, we had outstate Republican legislators saying that they would be willing to help us with this provision because they know it's unfair, even though the end result will mean less transportation dollars for every other school district if we get additional funds. But it's only fair since we're the only district that gets hit with
Right.
this.
And that's great inside information. Thank you.
So this is just coming from my recollection, but I know that I've seen in various documents, numbers associated
Yes.
with and different explanations. I kind of want to say in the emerging wisdom presentation, and you gave that to state legislators, Dr. Adams, there was a slide and this magnet school transportation cost, I believe, was one. The special school district payments, the result of VIC, which you also brought up with state legislators, Dr. Adams, was one. And I also believe pre-K was one. So if we want to include something in here about funding, possibly we could make it all 3, or we and just use that as the priorities as help us fix this funding, or do we want to pick one that we think either is a higher priority or is maybe easier to get through?
I think we could do either, Mr. Davis. I think what Mrs. Willis was indicating that what might make sense in some cases is to put a dollar amount next to these that are already existing to make it easier to explain to legislators, even if we just pick 3, but we still have backup information in the document as best we could. Like magnet school funding, I think Mrs. Banks is about a $6 million difference, somewhere around that amount, if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on it. But we would indicate that the cost difference here, this is a $6 million increase to the district if this occurred. Now, the challenge for us is the pot of transportation dollars are not going to increase, so somebody's going to lose some dollars. So that may be not good because they'll realize how much it is and not want to support it. So I think, I think to your point, it would make some sense to put some dollar amount next to the ones that we are listing as priorities. As one or two or three priorities, that might make some sense to do.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Steve, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think putting a dollar amount on certain items, which is to our advantage, and then possibly not putting them on, which would be to our disadvantage. I really think that, please remember, we should have 3 or 4 items that we go on offense on, and I'm all for that. I always have been. You know, you throw up enough darts, sooner or later, you're going to hit a bullseye and get something passed. But we're going into another legislative session, remember, where we're going to be playing a lot and the majority of the time defense. What I think is going to be a little different in the upcoming legislative session is because of all the unknowns in the upcoming elections. You know, with redistricting going on, we have no idea, you know, where some of the boundaries are going to be. I think the suburban is going to pick up some. Democrats will probably pick up some seats just the way redistricting comes out. But you've got a lot of people for these congressional seats that are opening up. So you're going to have state reps and state senators filing for congressional races. So there's going to be a lot of politics played next year, more so than public policy. So that's going to factor into some of the stuff. Again, you know, the school education choice groups are going to be putting one big major push on, because I think they know next year could be their last chance where they really have a good chance of trying to pass something again. Because once those elections take place next year, I think we're going to get more pro-public education legislators elected, and that will be to our benefit. So just try to remember that in the overall picture.
So with that said, Steve, what is our offense? What is our defense? What are the things we know are to come that we need to be better prepared for when it comes to the nuances of the politics, as well as whatever legislation is coming before us? What I'm hearing is that they're coming again. So are you saying we need to look at and make sure we're better prepared and equipped for this request to try to get the $17 million from the district?
I think we better be ready for a train coming through, because they're going to try it again, Ms. Cousins.
So we're saying we're looking at the 17 million as a challenge. And is there anything else we need to be better prepared for on this train?
Well, I think, and I'm not sure you were on the call just yet when we started off the hearing, but Dr. Adams, next week on Wednesday, the House Budget Committee is holding a hearing on local charter funding. I talked to the chairman of the committee last week, Cody Smith, and he told me that all the charter schools were coming. They were going to talk about deferred maintenance and talk about the local charter funding issue 137 from last year. And I just told him, I said, well, you know, we need the opportunity to give our side of the story to the House Budget Committee as well and present our figures and our numbers. And so he agreed to allow, so Dr. Adams is coming next Wednesday to Jeff City for the noon hearing, and hopefully get the opportunity to say, listen, this is our cost versus their cost. Why are you taking 17 million away from us when it actually costs the district probably $20 million more a year to educate the number of kids we have versus there? So I think by getting this information out early, that will help us. Although, you know, the Opportunity Trust, they've hired a lot of lobbyists, and they're going to make a push next year again. As I said, I think this will be the #1 defense issue that we're going to have to deal with, this and the virtual schools.
So with that
issue.
said, I mean, I get you're saying Dr. Adams is going, but this is where Dr. Adams needs definitely more support. It should not be waiting in the wings. If there's a hearing next week, Wednesday, then somebody part of this ad hoc legislative committee should definitely be on board and going down to rally our troops to let them know the effects that this would have. Is that safe to say?
Yes, I would welcome anybody on this committee to come down if they have the time to do it. Now, we're lucky. We do have some supporters on the House Budget Committee, such as Peter Meredith and Ms. Bosley. And so I've already talked to Peter Meredith about asking some questions during Dr. Adams' testimony to really put the charter schools kind of in a bind. We just need to get the truth out there because they're saying they're not getting equitable funding, which in my opinion is a lie. And I think we just need to, facts are stubborn things. They don't lie. And if we can show the numbers are there, I mean, that's very powerful in my opinion. That's what helped us last year stop this in the Senate. When the documents that Dr. Adams and Ms. Banks provided, that we were able to get to Carla May, to Jill Shoup, to Doug Beck, and that really stymied the charters in the Senate.
So I want to get to this on our agenda about resources that we need to identify. And it sounds like we might need to just start with next week, but then also longer term. But before we do, I do want to at least identify one more priority, and it sounds like a funding component is one of them. Let me ask you this, Steve, just as we're sort of like whether we should just list them all as a priority. I mean, we need to put dollar amounts, it sounds like, at least in the platform, but listing it as a priority. Last year, we were able to get, I think it was $2 million for a literacy program, which was 2.5. And you can explain how that happened or not, but would it be helpful to you if we identified as a priority, and I'm just going to pick pre-K, because I don't think it's controversial. I could think how it could be somewhat controversial, but I don't think it's controversial. So if we identify as a priority that we've been providing this very high quality pre-K program on our own dime, essentially, sort of scrounging the money together, and it has been very successful, and there's tons of research. The governor has identified pre-K. There's a new Office of Early Childhood. If we identified something like that as a priority, or it could be transportation, because transportation is always an issue. It's an issue for us. It's an issue for rural districts as well. If we had that sort of like as a priority that we've been pushing, if an opportunity comes up where they're like, okay, we want to give you some money. I know that we can't expect that, but if that happened, would that be helpful to you?
Sure it would.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, like pre-K, there was a bill this year that would raise the amount of pre-K, the qualification to the formula of 10% of the student population. I mean, that's an issue that outstate legislators, Republicans, Democrats alike can agree on. So that's always good. There's a price tag to it, obviously, but at the same time, Missouri's budget is in a much better place than it was several years ago. So there is some additional funds out there. I mean, and you got to remember how I got the money for our literacy program was, I helped Representative Dean Blocker as much as I could get into leadership. And he's a Republican, from the Dew area. And I was just in his office one day. He said, Steve, he said, what can I do for you? He says, is there anything in the budget you would like? And I said, well, sure. We got a new literacy program. I'd like $2.5 million for Dr. Adams and for the program. He said, all right, I'll talk to Cody Smith. We'll get it in the budget. That'll be my priority and my ask. I mean, really, that's how it came about. And so he was able, being in leadership, that helps. And the governor, as you know, didn't veto the money. So it's there. We just got to make sure that he releases the money. But with the majority leader asking for it, I think it's very helpful. And remember, I was very impressed with Dean Blocker that he said, listen, Steve, he said, I know I'm in the county, but he said, if the St. Louis public schools do well, the whole metropolitan area of St. Louis does well. And he said, if we can help you, he said, we're going to. So we just got to build those type of relationships where Republicans can help the Democrats and the city Democrats as well. And that's at least what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So I think if we're just identifying you know, we're going to have our list of things that we need to play defense, and we're going to have to, you know, use this committee and all our other resources like we normally do, but this committee especially to amplify the reasons and the communication and the advocacy for those. But if we're going to pick 3 or 4 priorities that we're saying to the community are important, and then also saying to the legislators are important. So if we start with 1, the local funding, that seems like an oppose, you know, can we keep the money that we have? Number 2, the homeless and gun violence issue is an advocacy issue. So we'll support things for that, which we'll flesh out, but that's an advocacy issue. But if we want to make number 3 an actual, like, this is something you can actually do for us that will help us. And if that's a funding component, which it seems like we're leaning towards, I guess I would open it up if, you know, what would we pick?
Well, I have another question for Steve. I guess based on the literacy program and the $2.5 million, what revenue stream did that come through? And I guess I'm just wondering if that's something that's more kind of like a one-off situation versus a statewide type of allocation that makes a big difference.
Well, it's one-time fund from GR. I mean, it doesn't go through the formula. It's kind of like the 1.5 million or the 750,000 that we got at various times for the option to remain program. It was just a payment to the district. That's how it was structured anyway through the budget. It was just a separate line item for the St. Louis Public Schools since we're implementing our new literacy and reading program.
And I think clearly those types of opportunities, though not easy, are easier than trying to get something like through the formula or through a funding stream that it would impact all districts.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I like the line item appropriation approach if we can get it. I mean, as former budget chair myself, I mean, that's how we appropriated a lot of money in my day. You know, you tried to avoid going through the formula, making it complicated. You just tried to do line items. And that's the cleanest way to get funds into obviously a district or whatever budget bill number it is. I think
Well,
the key to being successful in that is to make sure on any budget item like that, you have both Democrat and Republican support for it. And so while in the budget committee, Lakeisha Bosley and Peter Meredith pushed for it, they also noted that when it was voted on, they said, this is Majority Leader Dean Blocker's amendment. We're just advocating for it for our school district. And so, I mean, I was in the committee room. And so, I mean, you know, it was voted on unanimously by the budget committee. So that's unheard of, but that's just bipartisan. You have to have bipartisan support like that.
Steve, who's the chair of the budget committee?
Cody Smith from Joplin, Missouri. He's from outstate Missouri. And he is a strong advocate for school choice. I mean, strong advocate.
So I wonder, in terms of identifying a line item, you know, like the literacy program, that, you know, could benefit from, I mean, would benefit from a long-term investment, but a one-time investment at this opportune time, there was a program available for that investment. I wonder if that becomes more difficult this year and maybe in the continuing years, because we do have money to spend on one-time investments regarding the ESSER funds. So perhaps maybe a funding initiative as our support. Maybe this isn't the year for that. I don't know. I mean, it's probably always the year for it, but
I think
Well-
if I'm sorry, Mr. Carroll, I think the advocacy piece that you frame around homeless and gun violence, especially one around gun violence, as the PAC chair indicated, a one-time dollar amount to support school violence or violence might be a way to look at it. The ESSER dollars are not necessarily aligned for that purpose. And so some one-time monies focus around violence, which is obviously a major challenge in the city of St. Louis with over 53 students in the city of St. Louis being shot. And so I think it's a great advocacy piece to ask for dollars for that. That's why I think the notion of being very specific about what you want those dollars for will be helpful to legislators locally as well as outstate who understand the challenges of St. Louis as it relates to violence.
that's a great point, Dr. Adams. It makes a lot of sense.
Can I throw something in with that? Because it does make a lot of sense what Dr. Adams is saying. And if we're trying to tie it to something, that's all the more reason why you should have these community ed centers within the district, because that's addressing just what we're talking about. So that's something that can kind of be packed in with what we're going on the state side. But we definitely need to look at programs such as that magnitude to address, and because it would address the safety as well as the gun violence factors within our city.
So just to sort of recap, we've got number one is the local funding. Number two, we have legislation to reduce homelessness, which will flesh out. And then it sounds like maybe we do break out gun violence as number three, and we make that combined with a line item funding issue. Does that make sense? Okay, well, we're not tied. We've got our three, but we're not tied to three. Is there anything else on this list? And again, this is just to make it a priority. This is not that we're letting anything else go by the wayside. Is there anything else that someone wants to bring up? Ms. Willis?
Yes, you talked a little bit about resources that perhaps we could share or offer. And I just wondered from Mr. Carroll, if, you know, you mentioned that this is going to be a highly political year. So some of those legislators might well be aligning themselves with certain interests. They might be, we might be able to pair up with them once they declare what their interests are. How do you go about finding out as soon as you can where they're going to be headed and how we might be able to fuel their work if they're in our camp?
Their voting record.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless it's a new freshman coming in, but, the school administrators, the Missouri School Boards Association, they do candidate questionnaires. So you kind of know where a new one's coming in. I mean, you just have to go by the voting record of the current legislators. I'll just give you an example. Just last week, I talked with the state rep. I'm not going to say where or whom that is considering running for the state Senate. And he said, Steve, he said, and he has been supportive of public education. And he told me, he said, Steve, he said, I had a political operative pull me aside last year. And he said, if you don't get right on the education choice stuff, we're going to spend six figures against you if you try to run for the Senate. And that's the difficulty that we have, that these education choice and these for-profit companies are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in state rep and state Senate races where we don't have those resources. And so, that's why it's important to have the grassroots, certainly to have the school board members, the teachers, the principals, the school administrators, the school boards association. That's why it's so critical for all of us as a lobbyist, their team of lobbyists, Local 420, the other teacher organizations. We have to constantly stick together. That's our only hope to offset this, just humongous amounts of money being poured into this state. So, I mean, we certainly look at their voting record. I can tell you right now who's going to vote for us. You're only looking at about 25 to 30 legislators that you really might swing one way or the other on these issues for public education. The rest of them, that you just know where they're at. And there's just no getting them. And so it hinges upon that, 25, 30 folks to give our argument and say, this is the right thing to do.
That was really helpful. That's what I was wondering. Thank you very much.
So just sort of moving on, and we can go over these kind of quickly because, some of this is going to be homework for future meetings. But talking about potential resources to support our legislative priorities, it sounds like already next week, one of our resources is sending Dr. Adams to Jefferson City. Sounds like Miss Cousins wants to carpool. And Tony?
Yeah, hold on, because I heard you.
Well, we can arrange the bus, but later on. But in terms of that, so we do have that 3-page list. Is that right, Dr. Adams? Would that be something that we can distribute publicly? Is that something that we can make sure, and Steve, we can help you with this. We make sure that we get it into the hands of the budget committee. And I say we can help you with this because I've been being contacted by our local legislators knowing that this is coming up, saying, talk me through this.
Yes, we can provide whatever information you need as it relates to that. Ms. Banks and I have kind of teased the numbers out of, these are historical numbers, but yes, we could put it in a pretty format and get it ready to go for public distribution if you think so. If you think it would be helpful, yes, sir.
Yeah, I
think-
told Cody Smith, the chairman of the committee, that we would have documentation on our cost versus their cost on educating children. And just to let you know, because of the COVID-19, there's going to be limited seating capacity in the budget hearing room. So it is going to be a Zoom. You'll be able to see it online, but there'll be very few seats in this budget hearing. That's why, Dr. Adams, I'm probably going to go, since it's a noon hearing, I'll probably go over at 10 o'clock in an effort to secure us at least 2 seats in the committee room. I
Well,
mean,
try to-
that's
Well, Steve, try to secure about 4 seats. And
Okay,
if we can get that Zoom link, that would be great. And if we can get that information so that the parents, the community can actually start sending something to the budget chair.
okay. Well, I mean, it's through the Missouri House, and what I'll do is send out to Matt, and he can get out to the committee and send it out to whomever, the site that you need to get on the internet, and then how to zoom into that meeting. So in an effort, yeah, if we can try to save 4 seats, I'll get Rodney to go with me so we can save a couple seats each. So we'll try to work that out because seating is going to be a premium.
Yeah, because the chair definitely needs to be there. Matt, I think we're doing an excellent job there.
Are you driving?
Yes.
We'll talk about that. And then just going forward, I think any opportunities that we have to make stuff look pretty and disseminate it to parents. I mean, I can just give examples like, we had parents going to legislators' town halls and just like, I wouldn't say confronting them, but asking them questions and just saying, hey, I live in your district. I send the kids to St. Louis Public Schools. Last year was a mess. Please don't do that again. And that was just out of the genesis of what we did last year, getting them. So any information that we can give people who are busy, but then when things come up, they know where to go find it. I think that will be helpful. And Ms. Willis and I talked about that already before. I'm not going to put you on the spot to do specifics, but maybe that's a good topic for the next meeting.
Certainly.
To talk about a communication strategy.
A communication, regular communication that would provide information and education to everybody, including our parents. And then also an easy way for legislators to call us with their questions or to email us with their questions. Because if they get connected to something and they hear information that is incorrect, as it was stated at the last meeting with our legislators, then they would have the ammunition to correct. So, and they wouldn't have to hunt down Mr. Carroll. They would be able to just send information in and get a response.
Yeah, and so that's something that we could work on with you, Steve. If there's things, that you can identify that may come up that's, gonna need something that they can go reference. I mean, you're there all the time, but I mean, I see on these live streams, when stuff pops up, especially in like that last week, those legislators are on their phones. I mean, they're researching these bills, Googling them because they got to vote on it. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And then the next thing I just want to talk about is future meeting topics. So if there are, so I think probably the one thing that we're going to need to flesh out are specifics, partially on the gun violence issue, though we've got a little more direction on that, but parsing that out about specifics, and then also the homelessness issue. So perhaps we can all start thinking about how we approach addressing that next week. If there are, if it's, people from student support services coming back, if there's people from the community coming back, I mean, it's probably both,
Right.
that, come help us address that issue and then maybe help us flesh that out. So maybe that we'll just tentatively put that on the agenda for next time as a future meeting topic.
Mr. Chairman, can I also ask, or say that one thing I think would be helpful for this committee to also consider as we're considering what the priorities are, and as we're considering kind of what the communication strategies we're using, to also consider what the messaging that we're asking to be, which, also involves fleshing out kind of our stated position. But I think it's going to be really crucial if we're going to ask for community involvement and parent involvement in things like contacting representatives, making their voices known, making sure that they're aware and involved and active in this. Education on these issues is going to be a really crucial part. So yes, we can attach numbers to things. We can say, this is how much this costs, or this is how much this will be spent. But I think we're going to also need to be really careful about not getting too far ahead of where a lot of our parents are in the district, or a lot of our community members are. They might not be as well as informed as most of you are around the table. And I include myself in the less informed part of that. I include myself as someone who sometimes needs a little bit of catching up on how this works and what this is. So something else we might want to consider as part of a communication strategy is just kind of some basic, here's what this is, here's what this looks like, and here's how it impacts your child's day-to-day experience. Here's how it impacts your experience in St. Louis Public Schools. That's something that the Parent Action Council is very committed to working on this year, is educating parents on how St. Louis Public Schools works, how public education funding for St. Louis Public Schools works, both at the local and the state level, because I just think there's a general lack of understanding of how that works, because it is complicated, it's convoluted, it's hard to understand. And so I think it will be incumbent on us as a legislative committee or a legislative action committee, if we're asking people to participate in this, we're very clear on the messaging, and we take that step as educators to say, do we all understand this, yes or no? We call that a check for understanding in education. So checking for understanding is going to be really, really crucial. And I think we could make that a part of our work as well.
And I'm counting on you, Emily, and your group to help us identify that. Because absolutely, yes, Ms. Cousins.
I'm totally with Chairman Matt, totally agree. If I was there, I would probably actually try to kiss you, but COVID won't allow. I do think that is the huge missing piece to everything that we're actually trying to do. I don't want us to be that committee to try to go off and say, this is what you need to do. But you're so right to educate the parents. The parents want to know and want to understand. And I think we do need to educate them, but come to meet them where they are, because for a lot of people, like you said, you don't know how the legislative process works. You don't know what all of this means. But even if we as a committee are working with the parents to better educate them accordingly, so when we're asking them to come speak on something, they really know what they're speaking on.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is a new committee. It's an ad hoc committee, so it's not even a permanent committee. I think we expect it will be. And so the structure is absolutely open, feeling our way through this. I mean, if we need to take road shows, if we need to, go to PTO meetings, If, if we need to go to community meetings, I mean, the board is talking about doing stuff like that anyway. But if we can identify things where there's an education component that either come out of these three priorities, I would assume probably we're going to focus on these three priorities for those things. But, when we get into April and May, and, we have to start sounding the alarm, that's going to be the other component as well.
So I'll say the first opportunity for that is at PAC meetings, which we will be having on the third Thursday of every month virtually. So this is kind of an invitation, and I can certainly have conversations with anyone at this committee meeting, or anyone who's interested in speaking to that. We are targeting specific topics to cover each month to educate parents about whether that's structure, whether that's kind of the organizational flow of who you contact if you have a question, and also things like how public education funding works, how the state legislature works, what's coming up. So we're specifically targeting those topics. So having people at this committee or anyone who can speak to how those things work will be extremely helpful. And consider this the invitation to contact me if you are interested in being part of that process.
And you said the third Thursday,
The third Thursday, and it will be on Zoom. So
Okay.
those will all be virtual.
September the 16th.
September 16th is the first one. Yeah, you'll need to reach out to me directly or reach out to the PAC directly for the link, because we're not going to post that publicly. That's going to be something we keep internal. But if anyone either in this committee meeting or who's watching online is interested in participating in that, please reach out to the PAC. And that's in the District Digest, or will be in the District Digest, on how to get that information to participate in that meeting.
Great, thank you. Just a quick recap and then we'll adjourn. So we want to keep this to an hour. We've identified our three priorities. I think we're going to work with Ms. Willis and Mr. Carroll to strengthen the language on that. So we have that, and then we'll circulate that to Dr. Adams and then the committee. And then if we all, please, give us your input on that after we get that worded. And then after that, we will take those to the full board. We'll work on identifying the future meeting presentation, probably focusing on the homeless and gun violence component of that as an education piece to help us put more detail to that priority. And I thank you all for your time. Is there anything else from anybody?
Yeah, Matt, I need to add something. I hate to close on this, but I wanted to mention that next Monday at 1 o'clock in Jeff City, the Joint Committee on Education, they're going to have an informational hearing with regard to hearing invited testimony only regarding critical race theory and the 1619 project. Senator Cindy O'Laughlin is the chair of that. They've had one joint committee hearing on it where she invited certain people to testify. They're not allowing any public testimony on it, pro or con, whatever it may be. But we will be following that hearing because some of the things coming out of that are very concerning to me. The chairman even stated that she felt that maybe legislation needed to be introduced, that they would put cameras in every classroom to make sure that teachers aren't teaching that. So, I mean, this is a politicized issue, unfortunately, but we'll be watching that committee hearing and I'll report back to the board.
Steve, do we know who else is on that committee?
Yeah, I can send you the list of folks on that if you'd like for me to.
Could you please?
And so, Steve, I mean, I think the board approach has been, and Dr. Adams, you can add to this because I know you and Dr. Roberts have probably discussed it. We haven't really discussed it as a board other than we've just been sort of following the lead of our partner organizations. So we, as an informational, as just information, there was a very well done statement from the Council of Great City Schools. I believe the Missouri School Board Association has put out something as well and has worked on something. And it's so silly, really. But I think we're just going to follow their lead at this point, is my understanding. And I would support that.
I think that would be very wise at this point.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much. You know, if you have any questions for me, absolutely feel free to contact me. I thank you guys so much for your time. This is exciting. It's such important work. And I'm really grateful for you. So with that,